Hello everyone. So what I thought I'd try to do is try and get the whole of the World War One's section, all of the content that you need to know onto one sheet of paper. So that you guys, if you learn this really well and you learn the facts associated with it, if you get that element and then you know how to answer the questions, then you're sorted. So this is one part of it. This is then hopefully the knowledge you need. Then you're going to get how you answer the questions. You need to know how to answer the questions, particularly on the source questions. So let's get going. So this first picture, all these pictures on this first left-hand side, they're all about what the situation was by 1914. So by 1914, X-ray machines had been invented. In fact, in the 1890s, a German scientist had invented the X-ray machine. So he's called Röntgen. Your teacher can write that on the board. And they were really useful. So these X-ray machines meant that you could see inside the body. So you could see the location of a bullet or a piece of shrapnel. So they're really, really useful in helping deal with injuries on the Western Front. The problem with X-ray machines, though, is that they're not very portable. So you can't get them into the middle of no man's land to look at someone. They were often in hospitals and they were massive. They were very big machines. So they're not very portable, which is a bit of a problem. By 1914, we've got lots of specialist doctors and nurses. But again, although we've got things like fantastic doctors and surgeons who can do a variety of techniques and procedures, we haven't really got the volume that you'd need for the First World War. So one thing that needs to develop, just like X-rays becoming more portable, is we need a bigger variety of specialist doctors. So in 1914, we've got X-rays, but they're not very portable. And we've got doctors and nurses who are specialists, but they're not really specialists in the injuries created by war. We've also had some progress in blood. So in 1901, Landsteiner, he finds out about different blood types. So he finds out some people are A, some people are AB, some people are O negative. He finds out about these different blood types. Now that means that you can do blood transfusions. So if someone's lost a lot of blood during the war, they could perform a blood transfusion. But that meant that the two people had to be sitting next to each other to have the blood transfusion. It also meant that you had to know the blood type of the person you were transferring from and to. All of those things are too time consuming during war. There'd also been a lot of progress in dealing with infection. So if you think back to what happens in the 1800s, in the 19th century, we got lots of progress in dealing with infection. Lister had started using carbolic acid spray. Halstead had come up with rubber gloves. And people were washing their hands beforehand. So what Semmelweis had been arguing, what Lister had been arguing, what Halstead had been doing, meant that there were improvements in dealing with infection. But by 1914, there's some really important things we need to remember. A lot of operations would still result in amputation. Because if bacteria got deep into a wound, well, putting bandages wrapped in carbolic acid wouldn't work. They did not have penicillin. So penicillin had not been invented by the First World War. So there should be a big cross through that penicillin. It had not been invented. There were no antibiotics. So the only solution was often amputation. Just also, it might be worth writing in there, a lot of people got infections in the First World War because of where they were fighting. So the trenches were muddy, they were dirty, And loads of the fields had had fertiliser, had poo poured on them for previous years. So they were very, very rich soils with lots of bacteria in them. Okay? So by the time the war breaks out, there'd been quite a lot of progress in medicine, but penicillin had not yet been invented. So you couldn't give that to soldiers who had infections. Okay? So the first thing we're going to look at that goes in this next box is all about the trench system. So the trenches are divided up very slowly. The first line is the front line. So no man's land is the bit between the British and French trench and the German trench. And those soldiers who served on the front line would spend about 15% of their time on the front line. So the barbed wire picture, that's all about no man's land, that dirty area with all the shell holes and craters, and a really dangerous place to be. Then we've got the front line, where soldiers would spend 15% of their time. And here they'd be expected to stand in the saps that look out into no man's land, and they'd look over the parapet and see if they could shoot any of the people on the opposing side. Now these front line trenches were done in zigzag shapes, and that was to try and prevent grenades going off and causing the whole trench to collapse. They had sandbags and duck boards and all those things to try and reduce the impact of rain and mud. And they were connected with communication trenches. So those speech marks, communication trenches, connect the front line trench to the other trenches. So the communication trench would link the different elements of the trench system. So often students assume that once you break through the frontline trench, that's it. There's actually lots of trenches. So the communication trench connects the frontline trench to the next one, which is the two hands, and that's the support trench. So the support trench is usually about 200 to 500 metres behind the front line. And these people would be there probably about 10% of their time in the support trench. And these people, if necessary, during a big push or a big attack, they would go to the front line, or they would be there if the Germans were attacking, they'd be there to be able to support. And then the last one is the reserve trench. And the reserve trench would be there to kind of counter-attack if the enemy actually got through the front line. And they'd spend about 45% of their time there. So soldiers spent the majority of their time in the trenches in the reserve trench. Now, as you know, actually, although there's a trench system going on, they also buried underneath the trenches, and we end up with people actually fighting in the tunnels underground too. Now, the next section, this is all about the weapons. So these are the weapons that you'd get during the First World War. The first of those weapons is a rifle. Now, rifles were given to every single soldier who fought on the Western Front. And although they weren't kind of particularly fast firing, they were very efficient, and the bullets were very, very pointy. So it sounds silly, but they would cause a huge amount of damage if they hit someone's body. And they could fire accurately up to about 300 metres. We also had gas used in the First World War. Now there's kind of 4 different types of gas that were used. There's chlorine gas that would lead to suffocation. There's phosgene gas, which is just like chlorine, but it acts quicker and it will kill soldiers within a shorter space of time, within just 2 days actually. So we've got chlorine gas that leads to suffocation. We've got phosgene gas, which also leads to suffocation, but faster. We've got mustard gas, which causes blistering internally and externally, so inside and outside of the body. And mustard gas is interesting because if it was cold outside, mustard gas would be a liquid and would be liquid on your clothes, but as soon as you went into a dugout, it would turn into gas and it would then have an impact on people. So very, very dangerous. So chlorine and phosgene cause suffocation, mustard gas causes blisters, and tear gas cause people to, well, get really runny noses, to feel like they're crying. It's like really, really bad chopping up an onion. So you've got tear gas is the final one. And gas masks were only invented in 1915. So when they were first used, it was very dangerous. We're going to talk about that in a second. We've also got artillery. Now, artillery are actually responsible for more deaths in World War I than any other weapon. They could fire shells a distance of about 12 miles, and they often resulted in things like amputations because the blast that would go off would cause severe injuries to people's limbs. Very, very dangerous. The British famously used so many artillery shells during the Battle of the Somme that the Germans were sheltering in their concrete dugouts to try and get away from it. And the final one is kind of really from a shell, is that shrapnel, which is sharp bits of metal which were inside a bomb, would be released. So if you think of a nail bomb or ball bearings in a bomb, shrapnel is very sharp bits of metal from a bomb. Now these would explode and would cause horrendous injuries. These pieces of metal would be travelling between 100 and 300 miles an hour, and they would literally rip people's faces off. So they were incredibly dangerous and would cause horrific injuries. So they'd travel at between 100 and 300 miles an hour and cause horrific injuries. Now, when people got injured, they had lots of different options as to how they transported the injured back to where they could get some form of treatment. Now, one innovative way of doing it was taking people on trains. And they often did use trains to transport people who were wounded back to Britain. And they actually even changed some trains into kind of mobile hospitals where nurses would walk along and look after the patients. They had drips hanging down from the ceiling and all sorts. And they even made some into operating theatres as they were moving them back to Britain. The obvious problem with trains, though, well, they only worked on train lines. So unless there was an existing train line, they were very rarely used. Canal barges were also used during the war effort. Again, they were quite comfortable to be on, and they made returning maybe to a base hospital or even back to Britain a more comfortable prospect. But you could only go on them if there was a canal, and, well, it was very slow. So they weren't perhaps the best method of transporting soldiers back away from the front line. They also used mobile ambulances. So in the First World War, they raised a lot of money. And in 1914, enough money was raised to buy 512 ambulance wagons. Now, many of these wagons were motorised, but they often struggled to get through the horrendous mud around the Western Front. So many of those 512 ambulance wagons ended up being pulled by horses, who were used to being able to pull ploughs or really heavy machinery on the fields. So horses were used to transport the wounded soldiers. The problem with both of those methods was that they threw the poor injured soldier around in the back. So these uneven sort of wagons would cause their poor injured bodies to get thrown around. So it was incredibly painful for the soldiers involved. The final method, which was often used, but often used to bring soldiers back from France to Britain, or from Belgium to Britain, was ships. And again, this could be a very uncomfortable journey if soldiers were having to come during windy or particularly turbulent seas. But they were used to bring soldiers back to Britain. Sometimes people got what were called blighty wounds, where they got particularly bad wounds and they'd be brought back to Britain. Okay, so far we've looked at the trench system, we've looked at the weapons that they used, we've looked at the way in which they transported soldiers if they got wounded, and now we're going to look at the battles, okay? Now I haven't included all the battles in this, I've just included some ones that have got some really useful evidence for us. Now the first one of those of battles is Ypres. Now Ypres is in Belgium and is what we call a salient. So it's a bit that stuck out, so it could be attacked from all angles. Now there were 3 battles that took place at Ypres. The first one was in 1914. And it was very important because Britain were able to retain access to Dover. So it was very important because they were able to maintain access to to Calais. So they were able to maintain access to Calais, which was going to be used to transport wounded soldiers from. So Ypres, the first Battle of Ypres, is important because Britain were able to retain access to Calais. The second Battle of Ypres is important because it was the first time poisonous gas was used on the Western Front. And that was in 1915. So it's the first time poisonous gas was used on the Western Front. The third Battle of Ypres is very famous because it was when the sort of worst conditions for mud, rain and kind of trench foot were ever found during the First World War. So the third Battle of Ypres is famous because soldiers were drowning in mud and rain. It was incredibly wet and unpleasant, and that is in 1916. So I remember it as 1914, 1915 and then 1916. Next battle which I've put, which I think is a really important battle to be aware of, is the Battle of the Somme. So the one with the tombstone is the Battle of the Somme, which again was in 1916. And in 1916, it's famous for having the highest numbers of casualties of any day of fighting involving Britain. There were 60,000 casualties on the first day and 400,000 by the end of the battle. So 60,000 on the first day and 400,000 by the end of the battle. The next battle is the Battle of Cambrai. Now the reason I'm talking about Cambrai, which takes place in 1917, is because it's kind of got 2 reasons it was famous. 1, tanks were used. 450 tanks. And it was also the first time that Britain used a blood bank in a battle. So Cambrai is famous for tanks, where 450 were used. And it was also the first time a blood bank was used. And the final one, the underground symbol, that goes with the Battle of Arras, which again is in 1917. And at Arras, the British even built an underground hospital to deal with the fact that they had such high casualties during the battle. They estimate about 160,000 Allied casualties. The hospital they build underground is amazing. It had running water, had electricity, and it had nearly 500 beds. So Arras is famous for being the place of an underground hospital. So just to go through those really quickly, the battles. First Battle of Ypres is to keep the access to Calais, the port. The second Battle of Ypres is the first time gas is used. The third Battle of Ypres is to do with constant rain and mud, awful conditions for fighting it. The Somme is for the huge number of casualties. Cambrai is tanks and blood banks, and Arras is because of the underground hospital. Okay? Right, this next bit is all about the chain of evacuation. So we've got the letters that we all need to know. The first one, the S, stands for stretcher bearers. So we're kind of following, taking those people out of no man's land and getting them to safety. So we've got a poor injured soldier. The stretcher bearer would go out into no man's land. They'd give pain relief, and they'd carry them to the front line, maybe a little bit further, maybe back to those reserve trenches. They'd carry them. The problem with this is there's only 16 stretcher bearers for every 1,000 men. So there's only 16 stretcher bearers for every 1,000 men. So there weren't enough. And the stretcher bearers would often carry them all the way back to the regimental aid post. Now, the regimental aid post would often do their work in a tent, or sometimes in the reserve trench, or a trench kind of close to the front line. They're usually about 200 metres from the front line. And they would be helped by stretcher bearers to do first aid. And they'd get them either back to fighting or on to the next stage. So the regimental aid post would either go on to the next stage in the chain evacuation or back to fighting. Okay? Now the next ones are the advanced dressing stations. These guys are now probably about 600 metres from the front line, and they're often in abandoned buildings, dugouts, sometimes bunkers, and they'd have about 10 staff working there. Now, these guys would do exactly as the name suggests. They dress people's wounds. So they'd get them bandaged up, they'd get them dressed, they'd try and get it so that they could actually stem the blood flow if they were losing blood flow quickly. And you're trying to spend no longer than a week at the dressing stations, okay? Now the big one is the CCS, the Casualty Clearing Stations. Now the Casualty Clearing Stations would do a few important roles. The first thing they do is they triage the people who are wounded. they'd split them up into three groups. One group were the walking wounded. They can get patched up, they can return to fighting. The walking wounded. The second group are the ones who need severe hospital treatment. This lot would often be treated in the CCS or the base hospital. They might have an amputation, they might have some plastic surgery, but they need severe treatment. So we've got walking wounded, hospital treatment. The third group, these ones who are going to be made comfortable. They will die, but they're going to be given lots and lots of morphine to ease their pain. So one thing they do is important, is they triage, they sort them into those three groups: the walking wounded, the hospital treatment, and no chance of recovery. The other thing that they'd do is they'd actually start to kind of experiment and treat soldiers who had some quite severe kind of wounds and issues. And they could do this because they were about 7 to 12 miles away from the front line, and they were in abandoned buildings, so they could treat people there for their wounds. Now the final one is base hospitals. Now base hospitals were originally designed to take the most serious of injuries, but actually over time the CCSs became very important. And so base hospitals began experimenting with new techniques like plastic surgery and brain surgery. And they could get very, very busy during major offences. And during these big offences, these big pushes, they could end up with lots of patients who were being treated in base hospitals. And they divide the patients up, just like Florence Nightingale suggested earlier on, into head wounds, chest wounds, amputees. So they'd split the soldiers up for different treatments. Okay, so that's the chain of evacuation. We've gone from right at the front line all the way back to base hospitals that were now quite a long way away from the front line. They could be 20, 30 miles away from that front line of fighting. Okay? Now the last bit I'm going to talk about, these are things to do with kind of illnesses and solutions that they came up with during the First World War. So the kind of new techniques, maybe new ideas that they came up with. So the amount of lice meant many people in the First World War got trench fever. This meant that many soldiers actually started using their lighters to burn the lice which were underneath their labels and in their clothes. But it wasn't a very easy thing to solve. They also got trench foot, which was caused by the very wet, muddy conditions. And that was a bit easier to solve. You just needed to dry out your footwear and wear some clean shoes. Sorry, clean socks. But again, in the conditions of the Western Front, was quite tricky to solve in winter. But lots of other things they did manage to solve very well. So, at the start of the war, and all the way through it to be fair, lots of soldiers started to struggle with shell shock. We now know this as PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. This led to many soldiers being court-martialed and shot for cowardice. But later in the war, many soldiers were sent to Edinburgh, where a specialist hospital was set up to deal with shell shock. In fact, there were over 80,000 cases of shell shock in World War I, and 2,000 of those were treated at Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh. So Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh 2,000 people were treated for shell shock. So we've had an improvement there. At the start of the war, many were shot for cowardice. Later on, over 2,000 people were treated for shell shock in hospital, far more humanely. We also get huge developments in plastic surgery. So Harold Gillies developed some amazing new techniques in plastic surgery, including an idea called the tube pedicle, where he gathered a huge load of skin, got it into a tube shape, and then would attach this to a different part of the body, so you could regrow someone's face. So we get a new technique called the tube pedicle, which was very successful. A good example of one of his successes is William Spreckley. Now, William Spreckley had his nose blown off by shrapnel, and Gillies rebuilt his nose with a bit of cartilage from his rib. So William Spreckley is a great example of a success by Harold Gillies. Alternatively, Lumley is an example of a failure by Gillies. Lumley was a World War I fighter pilot who crashes his plane on his first outing. The plane explodes and he gets horrific burns on his face. Unfortunately, Henry Lumley dies of his injuries. In spite of all that, we need to know Spreckley's a success, Lumley's was not a success, but Gillies pioneers plastic surgery, and his advancements have an impact in the Second World War, not just the First World War. Another great pioneer is Cushing. So we get the American doctor Cushing, who pioneers brain surgery. And Cushing does three really cool things. One, he uses magnets to remove shells or bits of metal that have been lodged in the brain, maybe bits of bullets or shrapnel or something. So he uses magnets. He also uses wire to stem blood flow. So he tied arteries with kitchen wire. And he used the pneumatic cuff to stem blood flow in the scalp. So he uses a pneumatic cuff to stem blood flow in the scalp. Now those three techniques reduce the death rate from 70% to just 10%. So massive progress in survival rates. Another new technique is the Thomas splint. Now the Thomas splint was given to people who had broken their legs. And if you'd broken your femur, your biggest bone in your leg, the death rate at the start of World War I was 80%. So 80% of people who broke their femur would die. By the end of the war, 80% lived. So I like that example because it's nice to remember. So 80% died becomes 80% lived thanks to the Thomas splint, which is just a way of stopping the leg from moving. It's the Thomas splint. The army also supplied soldiers with a steel helmet, because 80% of wounds in the First World War were to the head, face and neck. So the steel Brodie helmet helped to reduce the number of head injuries sustained by soldiers. The Royal Army Medical Corps also used nurses very effectively in the First World War. They used the FANY and the VAD to do a huge amount of things to try to improve morale for soldiers. So the FANY would put on shows for soldiers. They'd bring travelling kind of entertainment along. They'd even do baths for soldiers and all sorts of entertainment to keep them going. So they found ways of keeping morale up for soldiers when they were injured or unable to kind of fight. They also drove ambulances, and we've got examples of them driving 22 drivers and 12 ambulances. So there was a right variety of jobs. They would supply food, they would supply clothing, and they do a right variety of things to try and keep up morale. So that's the FANY and the VAD did a variety of things to keep up morale for soldiers. Driving ambulances, putting on cinema shows, bathing lots of people who were injured, a right variety of things. They also invented mobile X-ray machines. Now, mobile X-ray machines were vitally important. So although X-rays had been invented, there were very few mobile X-rays until the war, and they made them much better and much more accessible. They were still, however, quite slow, so it could take 90 minutes, and they were still quite difficult to transport. So even though we've got some progress in sort of X-rays and mobile X-rays, they're not really perfect yet. Okay, so they had improved them, but they weren't perfect yet. And we've got, let me get the number of ones we've got. We had, out of 528 X-ray units, only 14 of them were mobile. So there weren't very many. So there's 528 X-ray units, only 14 are mobile. And they did rely on radiation, so they might cause other issues too. The next new technique is the Carroll-Dakin method. Now, the Carroll-Dakin method is where you'd wash wounds with a salt solution. Now, this really helped reduce the number of soldiers who died from infection. The salt in the wound would kill bacteria and prevent infection. So the Carroll-Dakin method was very important at preventing infection and therefore improving survival rates in the First World War. They also started to do something called wound excision, where they would cut out dead flesh around a wound before stitching the wound together. Again, this prevented infection. So they'd irrigate, they'd wash a wound with salt, or they'd cut out dead flesh. Now, the final thing we're going to talk about is improvements to do with blood. So during the First World War, they come up with a blood bank for the Battle of Cambrai, like we've already mentioned. And they're able to do this because they come up with a way of storing blood. They find that adding sodium citrate to blood prevents it from clotting. So if you add sodium citrate to blood, it prevents it from clotting, therefore allowing you to have blood banks where you can then have soldiers being able to get a transfusion without being next to the patient. So it allows blood transfusions to be done without you having to stand next to or sit next to the other person. Now, I know that was a lot of information to go through, and some of it I explained quite poorly, so hopefully a teacher's been able to help you out by writing it on the board and around it so you've got it. Thank you for listening.